She arrived at South Pass City in the Wyoming Territory on a Thursday in late September of 1869 with 11 cents in her pocket and a dress that had not been washed in 2 weeks. The settlement sat in a narrow valley below the Wind River Range, where the old Oregon Trail crossed the Sweetwater River one last time before climbing towards South Pass. Gold had been found along Willow Creek 2 years before, when soldiers from Fort Bridger followed rumors up from the river. And by the spring of 1868, the town had swollen to nearly 2,000 souls. The easy surface gold was already gone by then, and the men who remained worked the deeper veins at the Carissa mine, hoping the mountain had more to give than it had shown so far. The main street was mud and rough timber, and the smell of men who worked underground hung in the cold air. A row of buildings leaned into one another as though they were tired. At the far end, a mule stood hitched to nothing in particular. Jane Porter stopped in front of the boarding house and looked at the 11 cents in her palm. Then she closed her hand. A man was sweeping the porch, not lazily, but with attention, working the bristles into the corners. He had not looked up yet. She waited. She had trained herself long ago to stand still when standing still was all she had to offer the world. He looked up. "I can cook and clean, sir," she said. He set the broom against the railing and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. Not unkindly, but without hurry. The morning was cold. Her breath showed white in the air. "You have experience." "Yes, sir." "Where?" "In a household before. A good one, with a real kitchen and a wood stove, and a woman who taught me to put up preserves and render lard and bake bread that holds together." The household had broken apart after the mistress died, and Jane had not stayed to see what came next. She did not say more than that, and he did not ask. He finished the corner he had been working on, opened the door, and held it. "Your name?" "Jane Porter, sir. The woman who cooked here left 2 weeks ago. Meals at 6 and at noon. Your room is at the back." He showed her a narrow bed, a hook on the wall, and a window facing the alley. Then he set some coins on the sill and looked at the window instead of at her. "General store is 2 buildings down. Ask for the woman there. Tell her you need a working dress. She keeps some ready-made on a peg near the back. Can't have you serving meals like that." Jane picked up the coins. "I'll be back before supper," she said. The woman at the general store had the look of someone who had sized up a great many people in a great many conditions and found none of it remarkable. She lifted a plain dress from a peg, dark gray, sturdy cotton, cut for work rather than occasion, and held it up once. "You're at the boarding house," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." The woman added a heavy apron and set both on the counter. The gray would hold through the winter, she said, and there was a brown one in back if Jane came again when she had more coin. Jane paid what was asked, folded the dress over her arm, and walked back up the street. Daniel Harper ran the boarding house without waste. He kept his accounts in an open ledger on the desk, which Jane took to mean he had nothing to hide. He gave instructions once and did not repeat them, which suited her well. She was up before him the first morning. The fire was already lit, the coffee was on, and she was cutting salt pork at the block when she heard his boots on the stairs. Unhurried, with 2 steps from the bottom, heavier than the rest, where the tread had worn, she did not turn around. She heard him stop in the doorway, take in the room, pull out his chair, and sit. Neither of them spoke, and that was fine. The house held 8 men miners mostly, and one who called himself a surveyor, though his instruments rarely left his room. They ate in shifts. They were not unkind to her, but they watched her, the way men watch something new in a room they have occupied a long time, with a weariness that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with the fact of her. Within 2 days, the biscuits changed things. Jane made them the way her mother had taught her, with cold lard worked into the flour until the dough felt right, and they came out layered and golden in a way the men recognized as something they had not tasted in years. One miner pushed back from the table and looked at the ceiling as though doing a calculation. "Better than my mother's," he said. 2 others turned on him at once. Jane kept her back to all of them and worked the pan. She did not smile until she was facing the wall, and by the time she turned around, her expression was ordinary again. Daniel was watching from the far end of the table. When she met his eye, he looked back down at his cup, and she looked away. That was the first thing that passed between them that neither of them had intended. It was nearly 3 weeks before he said anything that was not about the house. He came in from the stable yard one evening in October as the temperature dropped fast off the mountain. She was at the stove. He washed his hands at the basin, dried them, and hung the cloth on the nail. Without turning around, he said, "You have family to write to." It was not quite a question. She moved the spoon in the pot. "My parents went the previous spring," she said. "Fever. My father first, and then my mother, inside the same week, as though she had decided there was no point in continuing without him." She said it evenly, the way you speak when the sharpest edge of grief has worn down from being carried. Not because it hurts less, but because you have made a kind of peace with holding it. Daniel stood with his back to her a moment longer than necessary, giving her the courtesy of not watching her face. Then he took his coat from the hook, folded it over a chair, and sat down. "I'm sorry for it," he said. She moved the spoon and told him she was grateful for that. The silence afterward was not uncomfortable. It was full, the way a room feels when something real has been said, and no one tries to cover it over. She found she was glad of that, more glad than she could have explained, and she did not try. The days arranged themselves into a shape she knew. She understood the rhythm of a house that needed tending, the quiet satisfaction of a swept floor, a stocked larder, and a fire that caught on the first try. Through the kitchen window, she could see the snow on the peaks of the Wind River Range, though it was not yet deep in the season. In the mornings, while the coffee came up, she let herself think about nothing in particular, and that was the first real rest she had known since the spring. One evening in November, after the supper plates had been cleared and the common room had gone quiet, Daniel stayed at the kitchen table with his ledger. Jane was wiping down the stove. He looked up and said, without any particular ceremony, "You cook well." She paused, with the cloth in her hand. "Thank you, sir." He waited. She knew he was not finished, though he had not framed it as a question. "My mother taught me," she said at last. "Not just the recipes. She taught me that a meal is a way of saying you are glad someone came through the door alive. The last thing I cooked for her was broth with barley, very plain, because that was all she could hold. She took 2 spoonfuls and looked at me and said it was exactly right. I have been trying to cook like that ever since, like every meal might matter." Daniel did not speak for a long moment. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside wind moved down off South Pass and passed along the timber walls. "I lost my mother when I was 19, he said, "in Illinois before I came west. I still think about her kitchen when I sit down to eat." Jane set the cloth on the block and looked at him. He looked back, steady and unhurried, and something passed between them that was not a hired hand's arrangement, and not yet anything they could name. He closed the ledger and said good night. She banked the fire and went to her room and lay awake a while, listening to the house settle her mother's voice still close in her memory, and Daniel's, new and quiet, beside it. December brought news that traveled fast through the territory. On the 10th day of the month, Governor John A. Campbell had signed a bill passed by the territorial legislature, granting women the right to vote. Wyoming was the first place in the nation to do such a thing. The men at the boarding house talked about it over coffee with more opinions than facts. Jane listened while she fried eggs and said little. Daniel read the notice in the Laramie newspaper twice and folded it carefully into his ledger. "A woman can vote here now," he said one morning, as though testing how the words sounded in his own kitchen. "And work and keep accounts and run a house," Jane said, "same as she always did. Now the law catches up." He looked at her, and something moved in his face that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of something larger. He nodded once and went back to his coffee. That same month he came in from the stable yard, favoring his left side. His shoulder held close, his jaw set in the way of a man who has decided not to mention discomfort. Jane watched from the stove, then set the liniment on the table beside him without comment. He looked at it, looked at her, and she had already turned back to her work. "Thank you," he said. She heard the bottle unstoppered behind her. "It is on the shelf if you need it again," she said, and that was all either of them said about it. But the kitchen felt different afterward, warmer, somehow, closer. His coffee cup moved over the weeks from the far end of the table to the near end, not all at once, but gradually, the way a current moves something without announcing itself. She began setting it there in the mornings. He sat without comment. The ledger work he once did in the office he brought to the kitchen table in the evenings. She mended, he figured accounts. Sometimes one of them spoke about provisions or the roof or the schedule, and the other answered, and then the quiet returned, changed from what it had been at the beginning. One night he watched her thread a needle, hold it to the lamp, and ease the thread through on the second try. "My mother used to do that the same way," he said, and looked back down at the ledger before Jane could answer. She threaded the needle and kept working because there was nothing to say that would improve on what he had told her without meaning to. If you were listening to this story, and it has found a place in your heart, I would be grateful if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a kind word in the comments. Stories like this one are written for gentle hearts, and your support helps more of them find their way into the world. Winter came down off the mountain in earnest. The men stayed in through the evenings with their cards and their laughter. Jane moved among them without friction, refilling cups and banking the fire, and the early mornings remained hers. In those hours, the house became smaller and slower lit by firelight and the pale gleam of snow through the windows. Daniel worked his figures. Jane worked her mending. Outside, the wind crossed the Sweetwater country and moved on. He began leaving things for her. A better paring knife on the kitchen block one morning. A thick wool shawl, dark green, folded over the back of her chair the day the cold came through the walls. Not new, but well kept, smelling faintly of cedar. She used both without comment. She understood that comment was not what he was after. Mr. Sherman came on a Thursday, in the middle of the noon meal. He was not a large man, but he moved as though he expected the room to make space, and it generally did. He had a good coat and measuring eyes. He wanted the two front rooms held on rotation for men coming up from the Carissa shaft. Meals and beds settled through the mine office at the far end of town. He laid it out as though explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "The boarding house does well because of the mine," he said. "Other houses in the territory have found the arrangement agreeable." Daniel listened without interrupting. When Mr. Sherman finished, the room had gone quiet. "I run this house on settled accounts," Daniel said. Mr. Sherman smiled, the smile of a man who believed patience was a form of power. "That is a fine principle for ordinary times." Daniel looked at him steadily. "These are ordinary times." Mr. Sherman turned then and looked at Jane the way you look at furniture you have not decided whether to move. The smile went flat. He buttoned his coat with deliberate care and left without slamming the door because he was too careful for that. Jane carried the plates into the kitchen and stood with her hands in the warm water until the tightness in her chest eased. She had known men like Mr. Sherman. What moved through her slowly was not fear, but the plain steadiness of Daniel's refusal.
A man who knew what was his and was willing to say so and bear what followed.
In February, word came through town that Esther Hobart Morris had been sworn in as Justice of the Peace at South Pass City, the first woman in the country to hold such an office. The appointment had followed hard on the suffrage law of December, as though one decency had opened the door for another. Jane heard the news at the general store and stood a moment on the street with her parcel, thinking of her mother, who had kept every account in their household fair and square, and of herself, standing in a mining town with 11 cents and a dirty dress, still here, still standing. The question came on a morning in late February, arriving plainly between one moment and the next. Jane was at the kitchen table with her mending. Daniel came down the stairs with the particular weight of a man who has made up his mind. He poured his coffee, stood with his back to her a moment, then sat across from her and folded his hands on the table. "I think you should stay on permanently," he said, "as my wife, if that suits you." The needle in her hand went still. Outside, a horse shifted in the cold, and its shoe rang once against the frozen ground. He kept his eyes on her, not pressing, just steady. She set the mending down and looked at the set of his jaw, the patience in his face, the hands folded in front of him, the right one still faintly marked where an old cut had healed. She stood and crossed to the window. The mountains rose beyond the alley, the same peaks the Fort Bridger soldiers had looked toward when gold was new in the country. She stood with her back to the room until her breathing slowed. Then she turned, crossed back, and held out her hand, palm up, the way you offer something you have decided to stop holding alone. He took it in both of his. "Yes," she said quietly, "the way you answer a thing you have known for some time and are only now permitted to speak aloud." They were married by the Justice of the Peace in town that spring, with 2 of the boarders as witnesses, and the surveyor's borrowed coat on Daniel's shoulders. The house ticked and settled around them. Down the hall, a man turned in his bunk. Outside, boots struck frozen ground. A door opened. Iron rang somewhere in the cold, and the world went on ordinary and sufficient with the 2 of them inside it. The girl arrived 3 years on, in the autumn, with difficulty, and then suddenly, and then there she was, warm and specific, and already herself. Jane sat by the hearth with the child against her chest, listening to the small, even breathing of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it acceptable. Daniel brought the low stool beside her chair and sat. He touched the back of the baby's hand with one finger carefully, the way you are with something that has already proven itself worth keeping. The lamp burned low. Outside South Pass City made its evening sounds, voices going quiet, horses settling, the far ring of metal from the mineworks winding down for the night. Jane felt the small chest rising and falling against her own, that rhythm, new and already necessary. Daniel breathed beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. She did not try to name what she felt. Some things are too large for naming. Naming them only makes them smaller. The wind came down off the mountain and moved around the timber walls and the good fire and the 2 of them and the child between them, and went on into the dark. The fire burned, the world continued. And that, dear listener, was the story of Jane Porter, who came to a mining town on the Oregon Trail with nothing but 11 cents and a worn dress, and stayed to build a home where meals mattered and promises were kept. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. And as always, thank you for sharing this hour with me.